Now, I was lucky enough with ITV to be in Istanbul in 2005, so perfect job, absolutely perfect job to be there to see that extraordinary So you do have to pinch yourself sometimes to think, I am here. All these fans have saved up and sat in the back of vans and scrabbled their way and fought their way to get to even be here, let alone the folks at home watching on the telly. And I'm lucky enough to be sent out here by the people I work for to sit and work on and watch this unfold in front of my eyes. It's actually relief at the end of a live program that you've got to the end of it and you haven't made any massive mistakes and that basically hasn't fallen off air and you've told the story of the game or whatever the program was as best you could. So there's a kind of end of the trial. It's like finishing an exam. It's like it's over.
I could do with every guest, Matt. I start at the beginning of their journey. How did sport become a passion for you?
Well, it was a childhood sport, both playing and following, for sure. It was a kind of family pursuit. Both mum and my dad's very keen amateur players. My dad's a good standard. And then similarly, me and my brother across different sports played all the way up into our teens. I'm sure, like a lot of kids, boys and girls, had kind of, quite foggy or unrealistic expectations or aspirations, I should say, of maybe it turning into a career. And I got to about 15, 16, got to a decent level in football and rugby and swimming. Those were my three kind of competitive sports, and competed to a kind of regional, county kind of standard, but got a bit distracted, as a lot of teenagers do, and perhaps also wasn't quite in the category of making a good living from it. So ended up going off to study and thus became someone that talks about it as much as somebody that ever did it.
You mentioned your social circle, your parents, your brothers, your family. How did that inspire you to fall in love with football and other sports as well?
Yeah, I suppose like a lot of kids, I had a brother and we were a bit competitive and we kind of pushed each other a little bit, although because we're only 17 months apart. But equally, we lived on a kind of classic street, which was a slightly sloped street, and there was a lot of kids lived on the same street. So we joined together to play whatever we could make up, really, whatever involved what we had. We used to play a lot of kind of games of Spot and Kirby and those kind of things. And if we had a bit of grass to play on, we'd play games of footy. And however, the bigger kids made it as rough and tough as they could. But it was all kind of part of fun and mixed in with, kids, I suppose, of my age and vintage. We were outside and doing stuff like that a lot. It sounds a bit rose tinted, and I'm not particularly drawing kind of analogies, but it was probably something that we all knew nothing other than, and definitely I think more or less enjoyed. It made us kind of physically active, which I think then becomes something you take into your sport and your enjoyment of activity, really.
And I love for Liverpool. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, that was the boyhood team I followed. It was my dad's team. It's the family team. But I think increasingly when you work in professional sport, or should I say on professional sport, that kind of tribalism fades and you get a bit more objective, I hope. You get a bit more analytical and you look for strengths and weaknesses in players, teams, competitions, and you try and ask questions about why things are working or obviously often not working as well as they should. Often those conversations are more interesting, I find, when teams are experiencing issues rather than when they are all conquering. But nonetheless, it's a talking point that I find endlessly interesting. But yeah, the kind of the fan part of me definitely has receded, and the kind of analyst part of me has grown.
Where do you think that comes from, that analytical approach? Obviously looking critical within the game, obviously looking at it through the lens of football, but I presume from your experiences in other sports, trying to kind of think critically about certain things. Is there certain experiences that you've had that made you have an outlook in such sense?
Well, I didn't study exactly to do the job that I now do. I came to the end of my school time doing A-levels, as they were still are. And I went off to university to do modern languages. So I did French, Italian, and European politics at Sheffield. And that involved a couple of years abroad and had a great time. But it's kind of one of those quite vague degrees that you wouldn't say had a definite direction towards a particular career. But I loved my time abroad and really wanted to kind of recapture some of that, and really wanted to go back to Italy in particular. I made a lot of friends and really enjoyed being there for the year I was, and really enjoyed learning the language. And I'd started as a really nothing more than a bit of a laugh and a kind of sideline to write for the student newspaper in Sheffield, doing kind of concert reviews and little bits of news about student issues, but didn't really have a very developed idea of turning that into a kind of journalistic career, to be honest. But I didn't know what else to do. I didn't really have any particular kind of fascination with other walks of life. My dad was an engineer and worked in a kind of woodworking machinery business, and my mum was a sociology teacher that she came to quite late in life. So yeah, those were particularly avenues that appealed to me, I must say. So I actually wrote to the correspondents whose names I could find in English newspapers that were based in Rome, and just wrote letters to them. And to their eternal credit, several of them wrote back and kind of said, look, I can't give you a job, but if you come and rent a room, there will be kind of, stuff that you can help me with, charging around, finding things out. And yeah, so I went on spec and just rented a room, and that got me started, led to a trainee period with an American press agency, which had a bureau in the centre of Rome, and then started working a little bit more for the English newspapers, kind of off my own bat for a couple of years, and then came back to start a slightly more formal kind of development, and that led into broadcasting. So it was all a series of kind of accident, really, or kind of finding out what the next kink in the road might lead to. And I loved sport. I hadn't particularly thought to work at it.
So just on that, with your academic profile, you mentioned languages. How has that benefited you in terms of the position you're in now? Obviously, communication's key, understanding culture, all those different facets. Is that something that's maybe made you think about what you do now differently?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I've been, I'd have to say, fortunate enough that it's landed kind of at my door where I've worked, that I've often worked on European football competitions and European sporting competitions. So covered the Champions League and the other European competitions a lot or pretty much non-stop really for the last 20 odd years. So that's very lucky for me, but it also means I get to use those skills that I developed a long time ago and have tried very hard to maintain. And I do to this day at times use those languages to interview players and coaches in certainly French and Italian, and to some extent, to the extent of my capabilities, in Spanish and Portuguese, because all of the European, or should I say Latin-based languages, have commonalities and similarities that allow you to just about develop without proper learning or degree standards tuition. You can learn enough to be just conversational enough to perform interviews. So yeah, I use them as much as I can and as much as the job allows, and that's a really enjoyable part of it for me.
How do you practice them languages then, Matt? Is it something that you do contemporarily? Do you kind of study different languages today? Do you listen to music? Do you watch sport in different languages? How do you keep up to date with that?
Yeah, in the ways that you might imagine. Obviously, we're in a strongly online and technological age, aren't we now? So access has never been better. It is very, very different to what it was when I was a teenager and a student, actually. In fact, although there were still ways to perhaps buy foreign language newspapers back then, but certainly through internet access, podcast access, radio. I mean, one thing, for instance, I do just sheerly for enjoyment, and it's not a kind of anything other than that, really, although it helps me, is sometimes when I've got a game that I'm covering on a Saturday, I'm traveling often in my car back from that game on a Saturday evening alone. So there's often an Italian game on in that time. Now, there isn't normally radio coverage in this country of that game, but through internet radio, you can tune your phone connected to your car, obviously hands-free, to the Italian commentary from the state radio station, which is called Rai in Italy, and you can listen to their commentary of the game, obviously in Italian, and that's a very enjoyable hour or two for me, because it helps keep my ear up and keeps me across who's playing well and who's not. So that's a little habit you can develop for yourself if you're able to. But there's loads of ways. My kids have subsequently, particularly my daughter, learned Spanish to quite a high standard, and she found lots of vehicles, like there's a slow news service in particular languages, so you can be given a kind of accessible standard of listening rather than just tuning into a full-scale foreign broadcast, which might be swamping for some starters. But you can get a kind of simpler version of it, and that helps you pick up the words and sentences and gets you started.
Have you seen a shift then in European football? Obviously, your experiences learning Italian and other languages, and obviously comparing that to the English game. I suppose during your time within broadcasting, you've seen a change on how the power has come to the Premier League and the advancement of the game. And obviously, you mentioned Champions League as well. What are your experiences and thoughts on that in general?
Well, I think football, I've been doing the job that I do around it long enough to realise that most things in sports are somewhat cyclical. So every kind of dominant force will grow, maintain, and then at some point be challenged, if not overtaken, by a rival. And you can see that obviously in within the Premier League and within the last 20 years cycle. You can see how clubs have come to the fore and then had fallow periods and so on. And that's the case, I think, with leagues as well. Obviously, when I was studying, Italy was the kind of dominant league in Europe, certainly in terms of attracting the top players and paying the best wages. And then you had that period through probably from, I'd say, around 2006 or so, for about 10 years, maybe more, where particularly the two, if not the three biggest Spanish sides probably dominated, particularly on the European stage, through a golden period for Barcelona with Messi, but also Real Madrid, obviously, particularly in the Champions League, which they kind of see as their competition, and a very strong and forceful Atletico. So they had that period, but then within that, you've had, the kind of inexorable economic and thus footballing power of the Premier League. So things do wax and wane somewhat, and you would be doing very well to have a crystal ball to know what it'll look like in 10 or 15 years' time. It's easy to sit here now and say, well, the Premier League will continue to dominate, and they may, but there's nothing that makes that for sure. Who would have foreseen sovereign wealth funds and state ownership of football clubs 20 years ago, and where that might yet take us, and what rules might come, and whether a Super League will ever take off, or will UEFA just find their own method of creating something that is analogous to that? I don't have the answers, but it'll be an interesting part of the job finding out.
Yeah, I was going to add to that. Do you think that will change maybe the broadcasting industry with the accessibility of certain amount of games played? Saudi Arabia trying to make it more of a worldwide appeal within football. Do you think that will impact that at all?
I think that is another part of this story which is always changing. I mean, I think my experience of broadcast is that TV companies often are looking for something innovative, something new, something that catches the eye or the ear, and obviously either holds or attracts an audience, and a new audience, particularly ever younger. We're obviously now trying to grow, not before time, the women's game in football, and that might create a new generation of football followers amongst men and women, boys and girls, and that's a fantastic expansion of the game. But I think, broadcasters will look for new ways, and you can see, for instance, with technology now, streaming is starting to replace what traditional broadcasting kind of looked like. So we can watch games in so many easier ways now, can't we? Through our phones and tablets and laptops, almost kind of on the move, wherever. I just talked about listening to games on the radio in the car from around the world. So with that will come the chance to watch more teams and more games. And with that might come, I think, the inexorable will of the big clubs to want an ever bigger piece of the pie that they feel they create, because those clubs obviously want more and more ownership and revenue from what they are offering. So whether leagues, at the moment, obviously there's a collective bargaining for the Premier League, but you know already, I'm sure, and the listeners will know that, for instance, in Spain, that cake, although it is a cake, it is divided unequally, and the biggest teams get by far the biggest share of that broadcasting cake. And with, I think, the advent of streaming clubs, and that's partly what drives this idea from Barca and Real Madrid, particularly of the Super League, is that they want control of their own income, and they feel that they generate more than they get at the moment globally, and thus want eventually the reins of the money that they create.
Interesting. I want to bring you back then to your original point. You mentioned your academic development, foreign languages, Sheffield, and get the opportunity to write. When was the moment when you knew you were good in front of a camera? Can you remember that time and how that experience was for you in terms of broadcasting to an audience or to a stream or whatever it is that you were doing? Can you remember that moment?
I don't think it's a moment. I don't know that it is something that anyone's necessarily kind of given as a predilection or a talent, although obviously it would appear that some settle to it more than others, overcome their inhibitions, their stresses and strains that kind of can come, particularly with a live environment. I don't think anybody finds it exactly easy. I would doubt that, no matter what they might tell you. But it does maybe suit some more than others. And I, as I mentioned, started in kind of newspapers, then ended up through, again, a series of kind of coincidences and accidents and opportunities, for which there's many people to thank, getting a chance first on a Channel 4 show, which was a foreign affairs show called The World This Week. That led to the possibility of joining the BBC as a kind of news reporter. Worked for breakfast news and in the business unit, God help me, that I didn't know much about, BBC. But then eventually wandered into the sports department and thought, this is suddenly my kind of eyes were open to the opportunities that would entail. And with that came a lot of chance, first on the radio and then on the telly, to really find your feet. And in sport, compared to news, it is much less of a scripted environment. It's much more of an ad-libbing kind of environment. And that can be very daunting at first, but you sink or swim a little bit. You kind of learn to find the words in the moment rather than having to pre-write and deliver them. Now, news has to be very careful with the language it uses, and it has to be very fact-based. And sport does some of that, but it also is quite conversational and it's quite opinion based. It lends itself through commentary and obviously analysis and just the general way that it presents coverage. It finds a tone that is a bit more in the moment, and so you have to be part of that. You have to develop those skills. So I think I developed them and found that I could increasingly cope with the kind of pressure that came with that. So I guess I've got better at it. I hope I have, and learned to avoid some of the pitfalls.
And obviously coping with the process, working, for example, on ITV, you get different types of pundits, different types of characters, ex-footballers, people with egos potentially. How do you bring that neutral perspective then? How do you bring that balance to your show to ensure that you're getting the best out the pundit, but also the listeners getting a fair chance to obviously understand some of the things that have happened during a game and how that can be broadcasted effectively?
Well, that is the role. I think you have to understand, and again, it does change, but my kind of formative period and learning, again, lots of people, I think you inevitably should, and everybody does magpie a little bit from what they see around them or that has gone before them. So I was lucky enough to spend a bit of time either around or with people like Des Lynam and John Inverdale. So a generation above me who had become obviously very good at what they did. And so they'd either give you the odd tip if you were lucky enough, or you'd simply try and glean little bits from the way they operated. And I think in that time, the role, and I still think it applies, the role of that person in that coverage is to be the conduit to the viewer and listener at home, to try and ask the questions that they would want answers to, and really to get the best out of the experts that are in your presence and in your company. So if they're good, then you should let them shine or give them the tools to explain to the folks at home what's going on that they can't see or hear for themselves. So it does change, and I think we're probably in an era at the moment where it's changing again, and I think it's starting to find a new way of delivering some of the same things to its audience. You sense there's perhaps more of a drive towards a personality type broadcaster who's looking for kind of style and colour and humour and noise and all those things that are perhaps just part of the modern vernacular, part of social media kind of age that we are in, where you need to shout that bit louder to be heard. That's a kind of adjustment for me, and I'm not sure I'll ever be that kind of person or broadcaster. But to be in the space, I think you have to acknowledge that is a direction of travel. So you work with the people that you work with, you get to know them, you get to know what makes them good or what makes them tick, and thus you try and push the right buttons.
Do you think that can be learnt then in terms of being a good broadcaster? You mentioned obviously surrounding yourself with Des Lynam and other characters, but also, you know, from your own perspective, being an effective communicator, knowing when to maybe ask questions, when to probe at certain things. Does that come instinctively, or can that be learned? I'm just interested on that.
I think that's a learned skill. I do. I think some people obviously have a natural curiosity, and a natural yearning to know. And that really is at the heart of what makes anyone who wants to be involved in journalism. That is what it boils down to. I think is eliciting stories from people you meet and then turning those stories, being the filter that turns what can be quite a broad and slightly swampy version to condense that down into a slightly more digestible and kind of interestingly flavored plate for someone to kind of, enjoy with you. I think that's what you do as a kind of story finder and thus story enabler, if not sometimes storyteller. I think that's what happens in presenting and reporting. And then obviously in football or sports commentary, you are someone that then adds that layer of information and insight that brings a game a bit more to life for the person and people watching. So, yeah, I think it is a learned skill allied to a natural kind of curiosity. But I think the knowing when to push, when to shut up, how to get the most out of the next 2, 3 or 4 minutes, which is often what you get, particularly on the telly for a topic to be covered. That's quite a short time, although you can achieve a lot in it. But there is an art and a skill and a learned skill to getting from A to B as best you can in the time available and thinking about an arc that a conversation needs to have, because it looks relaxed. It looks slightly like it all happened on the spot, but it comes from experience and preparation and rehearsal.
You mentioned obviously that the industry's changed to some extent. You mentioned social media and the different types of influences that might be getting opportunities. What are your thoughts on that as a whole? Obviously reflection of the many years that you've spent, you've probably done jobs in terms of when you were beginning and kind of trying to earn your stripes to get opportunities. And now we have this obviously culture where there's so much accessibility to media, and there's so much opportunity through social media and different platforms. What are your thoughts on the emerging trends of broadcasting and how that might actually impact the way that it's delivered? Does it improve the quality of the delivery? I'm just interested in what you think of it as a whole.
Yeah, I think you have to learn to stay relevant to the audience, and you have to remember what the core qualities that, as we've talked about, ally to the job itself. But equally, you have to move with the times. You have to stay part of why and how the conversation works for the folks that want to listen or watch it or read it for that matter. So you can't bury your head in the sand. I don't think you can just say, well, this is me over here, take it or leave it. I don't think that's a formula for success. I think others will come with new ideas or newer ways and walk past you. That's not to say you should ever stop being yourself, but equally yourself should never be a fixed kind of point that never evolves. I think you as a person, as well as a broadcaster or an operator in a given space in this particular industry that we're talking about, which is mine, then I think you should be looking to grow. You should be looking for always develop new skills. I've started again in the last year for the first time in 20 plus years to commentate on games again. And I'm fortunate enough that my kind of main employer in TNT Sports have given me opportunity to commentate on Italian and French football in English for obviously viewers in the UK. But it's been really enjoyable and it's tough. I work sometimes with a co-commentator, so an ex-player or coach, but often on my own. So you've got 90 minutes plus the half-time interval, and it's just you and the microphone and whatever you've got in your head or written down in front of you to try and bring that game to life and make sense of it. And that's hard. And it's quite different to the skills that I've developed over the last 20 years in some ways. It's the same topic area, but you're working in a quite different way. You're not bouncing off somebody else. You're not really often asking direct questions. You're thinking about how much to say and not to say, because there's an art, obviously, to that. If you talk too much, people get fed up. If you don't talk enough, then the gaps get a bit awkward for the folks at home. You can't just go off and make a cup of tea, go back 10 minutes later. And you're trying to think about ways to add value, not just say, he's just passed to him, or he's had a shot now, because clearly people can see that. So you're trying to think about what can you bring that adds a layer of interest and storytelling to it. So some of the same skills, but definitely different things, asking of yourself. And that's good. I think that's good for all of us to keep trying to grow and get better at what we do and trying different things that make that happen for you.
Absolutely. And I don't really want to make the conversation go down this route, but obviously you'll see in the media at the moment a lot of the council culture situation, the equality situation, and the argument of whether people putting positions down to maybe diversity and all these other facets that are happening contemporarily at the moment. And that's the reason why I asked around that question around how the industry is changing, how that's shifting, how that might actually impact you as an individual. Again, just interested on what you think on that.
Yeah, I think it was time that the space that I work in became more representative of the people it wanted to appeal to. Definitely, I think there was a time when I started that it was absolutely dominated by white men who had a certain probably commonality to the way they looked at the sport they covered and the conversations they had around it. And I think there were a lot of people that probably sat at home and thought, who's talking for me and to me? And that has grown, and quite right. It was overdue, long overdue. I think there's still some way to go. I think we are heading in a good direction, a healthy direction. Now, with these things, obviously, it's always a bit trial and error. There's always an element of, as opportunity occurs for people, they've got to do the best they can with that, and not everybody will get the long career that they might dream of. That's natural. That happened before, and that should happen. It is a competitive and quite judgmental, quite subjective industry, isn't it? You're never gonna, in those roles, appeal to every viewer, every listener. It's just not possible, no matter even the most popular among us, and I'm certainly not including myself in that. But if you talk to someone I've worked quite a lot with in years gone by, someone like Ali McCoist, you think is a kind of, universally liked character, and quite right too. He's got a lot of things that any broadcaster would want, and they come naturally to him, and a lot of experience now as well. But he won't appeal to everybody. He played for Rangers, half the Celtic fan base, as you can imagine. But if they wanted to like him, can't bring themselves to. So that's the nature of it. So you've got to be yourself, as I've said a couple of times. You've definitely got to be true to who you are. You've got to keep trying to be the best you can be, and that involves learning new skills. And then I think you've got to be as relevant as you can to the people you think want to hear what you've got to say, or would appreciate the skills that you're bringing to the job and what that entails. Now, people will get better. They get opportunity, and then can they develop? Can they get better? Thus, can they stay in the job? Because if they don't, someone else who also represents the audience will come along and take that spot from them. So you don't get 1,000 chances. You get a couple of chances if you're lucky. In fact, you probably get one if you're lucky. And then it's for you to show the people who make these decisions that you can do it.
Have you ever been in a situation where you've challenged maybe a pundit based on their outlook towards a half-time interval, or maybe a full-time post-match conversation, and you've actually tried to challenge maybe some of their perceptions? You don't agree with any of their perceptions? Again, obviously from your perspective, you have to be neutral.
Yeah.
Obviously, there might be occasions where you're thinking a bit unfair there. I'm just interested in what where that's happened, or
yeah, I think you've got to feel that you have the right to challenge, because otherwise, what are you? As long as you feel you're fairly or doing your best to represent the folks at home, then I think that's the kind of ship that you cling to. If you think in your mind, and obviously a lot of this is kind of thinking ahead and planning for what might happen next, but you are also reacting in the moment to whatever, and you don't know what exactly somebody's going to say. And some of them, as you well know, some of those pundits can be very off the cuff and suddenly throw a stone that causes ripples in the pond. So you are that is the challenge of the job, really, to be both organised and up on your toes, if you know what I mean. Yeah. So I think you should be able to challenge them. Now, obviously, you work as a team, and the team works best, and I think the program works best when the team works together. So it doesn't want to be a club. It doesn't want to be too chummy, because I think that then excludes the people that listen and watch. I think you want them to feel like they're part of it with you. So thus that connection from you to the supporter and viewer is as important as what they perceive as your cordiality or friendship is with the pundits that you work with. And some you're friends with, some you don't see from program to program and only speak to in that kind of professional capacity. And that's just the nature of it. I've had probably more pointed chats or awkward moments when you speak to players, and in particular managers, obviously before or after games when it's not going well for their team. And then you have to be brave enough to ask what you think are the awkward questions, and they sometimes don't really want to answer those questions or don't want the aggro that they perceive you to be bringing. But again, if you're doing it on behalf of the viewer and you think it's fair, I mean, I would always say to young broadcasters that aspire to work in the industry, 2 things to think about in terms of any question you might ask of anybody really in that situation. Is it fair? So does it cross any personal boundaries? Is it abusive? Is it unreasonable when you ask a manager whether they're expected to get the sack? I think that's questionable how fair that is, but sometimes you have to go there. So is it fair, and is it likely to get a good answer? So if you can tick both those boxes, you're well on the way to asking the right kind of question. And thinking about it in advance is better than something that just blurts out. So you have to walk through it in your head, and then obviously you have to listen carefully to what they say.
So just on that then, Matt, so you mentioned obviously interviewing managers and those big occasions. Obviously from your perspective, you know, you've been involved in European Championships, World Cups, big Champions League nights. How do you prepare for such an event? Is there anything that you do during the process leading up to such occasion where you prepare? Do you read, you research?
Yeah.
What things do you do just to ensure that when you get into that environment, you're competent and it's a bit more of a flow for you going in that situation?
I think you're always doing that in I suppose in most walks of life, in most jobs, your daily diet of kind of curiosity and learning new things should and is there, isn't it? In whichever job you do, really. So you're always topping up, and there's always new things to learn. There's always new players coming on the scene. I mean, for instance, a couple of weeks ago, I was in Belgrade covering Man City's last group game, a dead game really for both teams. So Red Star just played for a bit of pride. Man City had already won the group. And because of that, they took a couple of younger players and started both of them, I think, both of them in the game. And thus, they are 2 new characters and footballers for you to get to know. And thus, obviously, therefore, you'd hope that the folks watching would want to know about them as well. One scored, and then the other scored. Both, certainly on their European debuts. Oscar Bob, the young Norwegian striker, I think had made a couple of appearances for Man City before, maybe even starts, but this was pretty sure this was his first start in the Champions League. And young lad Hamilton, who played his first senior game for Man City in any capacity, scored after about 19, 20 minutes. So he was absolutely, as you can imagine, head in the clouds, even after the game when we got a chance to speak to both of them. So it was great. It was great for me to kind of learn about them. And you obviously are aware this might happen. So you read around these new members of the squad, but you're always preparing, you're always reading, you're always talking to the people you're traveling with, whether that's the commentator, the co-commentator, the folks at home who are organising, preparing the programme, what kind of ground we want to cover. If we speak to that person, what kind of stuff would we like to find out about them? So there's that team environment that if you all work together, it's like a jigsaw puzzle that comes together. I think television is, because it's so labour intensive, there's a lot of people work on it, and there's a lot of jobs that you find out as you move into that line of work, which one kind of suits you best. And working together is always what makes for the best show.
And are those principles still the same case when you are commentating or presenting on other sports, darts, snooker, other sports that you might be involved in? Do you still take that same alignment and that adjustment to research and find out, more information around the situation?
Yeah, because obviously I've covered football non-stop now for probably 25 years, but other sports I've kind of picked up along the way, not because opportunity came around, not that I didn't like them or wasn't interested, but until I got the chance to work on the darts when it came to ITV, I'd never worked on darts before, so I didn't have that kind of daily, weekly diet and knowledge. And I haven't worked on the darts now for a few years, so if I did, I'd drop back in now suddenly to this amazing story around young Luke Littler. I'd feel like I was starting a bit from scratch. So I'd be running very fast to try and catch up with all of that kind of background info that comes with working on something week in, week out. Similarly, whilst I've been at BT and now TNT, I've worked on cricket, which I had done before, but not for a while, and suddenly was going to go and cover an Ashes series in Australia. So again, there's a kind of running to catch up feeling, and a kind of trying to make sure you're not, whilst you never can be the expert that the ex-player would be, or someone that's worked in a sport for 20 plus years, you want to make sure you're as prepared as you can be to ask the questions again on behalf of the viewer that seem like the right questions, and lean on those pundits maybe a bit more than you would otherwise feel that you needed to make sure you cover the ground that was right for the for the people at home. And again, you won't please everybody. And if you're new, there's always a kind of, well, who's he? Who's this guy? Why is he covering the cricket? Where's David Gower? Where's Jeff Boyster? And you just have to kind of fight your way through that as best you can, and hope that if they don't get rid of you before you've found your feet.
So just on that then, Matt, so you mentioned obviously having that persistence and having that determination to stay contemporary, stay relevant to the audience. And obviously if you're coming into a new environment, obviously you have to try and impress and make sure that you stay within a certain program or a certain news channel. What do you do then in terms of your outlook towards that situation? What is your mindset going into that environment, and what has it been in terms of making sure that you have continuous opportunities within sports broadcasting? And obviously you mentioned different people that might say certain things and that might actually impact your confidence potentially, or you might doubt yourself. Is there anything that you've done during your career that's enabled you to actually stay driven towards a certain cause that you have in your mind?
Yeah, I suppose I've learned to be the best I think I can be at it, and I think though that hinges on the right approach as I would see it. Now that I think comes down to a few things, and they might sound slightly contradictory, but I don't think they are in the end. I think you need to be yourself, whilst at the same time being willing to learn and develop. So I think those two might sound slightly in conflict, but I don't think they are. I think as long as you are not trying to be someone you're not acting, you're not playing a part. I know the viewers will think there are particularly some pundits that kind of inhabit a persona on screen. Well, that's their choice, or maybe that is just who they are. But for me, as long as I would be pretty much the same on air as I was off air, then I think I'm being true to myself. Equally, if I'm developing the skills and the knowledge that comes with the territory and trying to stay as relevant as I can to the people at home. So I'm not this kind of Luddite or curmudgeonly, and now that I'm in my 50s, this kind of old fart approach where I don't want to hear about social media, I don't want to hear about VAR, I don't want to hear about tech. You've got to kind of stay with the trends that surround the sport and the conversation that surrounds the sport, and think that you can be a small part of that. And then I think the third thing is you've got to be a team player. You've got to be someone that other people would want to work with. Now, again, that's subjective. I can't be at all things to all people, nor would anybody expect that, I'm sure. But if you are not someone that is difficult, shouty, too demanding, or awkward, or socially inept, or whatever, think that the kind of, obviously the job requires certain skills. So you need to be personable, you need to be open-minded, you need to be curious, you need to be definitely willing to kind of work within a team environment and for everybody's benefit. Then I think if you keep that to the forefront of your mind as well, then you shouldn't go too far wrong. And then you need some luck. And you're not in charge of that, but every job needs a bit of luck.
If authenticity is important to you, how do you self-reflect then? So you might be in situations where you've had a bit of a bad moment, or you thought you could have been a little bit better and you're a bit deflated. And obviously you're coming up, you mentioned you drive home and you put your Italian on and you kind of reflect via that way. What do you do to ensure that when you go into the next program or the next opportunity that you become better and you enhance maybe the past experiences that you've had? Is there anything that you do to reflect in order to improve?
Yeah, I think there's two things, and again, they sound slightly in conflict, but I don't think they are. I think you definitely, you do that. You do reflect and try and get better if you've made a Horlicks or something or whatever. And you think about, if that moment came around again, how would I deal with it better? Would I ask the question in a different way, or would I try and find a way through that awkward subject that might be around it? For instance, obviously we've had, sadly in football recently, terrible instances with players collapsing on pitches, and that's obviously a difficult time to try and get the balance and the tone right as a broadcaster, particularly if you're live at that time. And I've had that myself, and it can be obviously the worst of all scenarios where the player doesn't recover. But happily, there have been instances at the European Championships with Christian Eriksen, and obviously now more recently with Tom Lockyer at Luton, where although it's been a very traumatic time, they have recovered, at least in Tom's case initially, to be with us, and now to work out whether he can ever play football again. But first things first. So you have those situations and you try and learn how to be the best you can in them. But equally, everybody that's worked, in my experience, on live radio, television, gets a kind of slight kind of release that is actually relief at the end of a live program, that you've got to the end of it and you haven't, you hope, made any massive mistakes, and that basically hasn't fallen off air, and you've told the story of the game or whatever the program was as best you could. So there's a kind of end of the trial. It's like finishing an exam. It's like, it's over, you know? And that sounds more painful than it actually normally is. And of course, you learn to be more kind of even-tempered with that. But it stays with you forever. That feeling of, we got there, we made it, we did our best today. And because it's like that, and you can't change it, it's not like a film that you can keep going and re-editing, and a documentary that you can keep tweaking. This is the nature of live broadcasting, that when it's done, it's done. You get in your car and you listen to your Italian football and you drive home. You can't change it. So learn to leave alone and learn to live with it and be the best you can be. And then you gave your best. That's it. Move on to the next one.
So just to add a layer to that then, so everyone knows you, Matt, as the guy that's on TV. You know, you get to see you get to go on these great opportunities, traveling Europe, football, sport. What is the most challenging part within broadcasting? Because like I said, it's glamorized to some extent in terms of what you do. Mm-hmm. You're seen as having the best job in the world because you get all these fantastic opportunities, but also there's potential downsides to that as well. You know, a lot of traveling, maybe coming away from home, etc., and all those different things that I'm sure that you can elaborate on. But is there anything that you think's hard being within broadcasting? Just for those that are listening and watching that might be inspired with some of the things that you've said, but don't necessarily see maybe the other side of the coin, if that makes sense.
Well, of course, there are those times where you're away a lot, and that can be awkward if you've got, obviously, family at home that you wouldn't want to miss key moments and days and times, and you can have conflicts around that. I mean, your employers often will do their best, but clearly if your kid's birthday is on the same night as the Champions League final, you've got a big problem if you can't be in two places at once. So you do have those days that you just, can't make life as perfect as you want it to be. Now, those sound like quite, relatively first world problems, if you want to give it that kind of epithet. And yeah, the travel can be tiring or draining. Certainly the kind of late night drives can be, you have to make sure you don't fall asleep at the wheel. Obviously you're being sensible about trying to get from A to B and live your life in the right way. But I wouldn't moan too much about those things because they come with the territory. You know what you're signing up for. The job is the job. It has days where you are at home as well as days where you are away. So I wouldn't want to be too much of a moaner about that. What I would say, I suppose, is that it is more precarious, I think, for almost all of us than it perhaps first appears. You don't exactly, in my type of work, you don't have a permanent job. You have often, sometimes quite short, 1 year, sometimes less than that, agreements with broadcasters. If you're lucky enough to get the opportunity in the first place, you can be either completely freelance where you're hired from job to job, or you get 1 year, sometimes a bit longer if you've established yourself, but rarely more than, say, 3 years of a deal, and that will run out. And your boss might change, the rights might change, the tastes of the viewing public might change, the opportunities might come and go. So you need to flex and cope with change that is not within your control. And sometimes you can feel that the tide turns away from you despite your best efforts. And you think, well, I felt like I was doing a good job there, but I'm suddenly not required, or they've decided to get this other person to work on the thing that I was working on, or whatever it might be. And that can be hard. And you can get quite stressed and anxious about that, particularly when it comes around to trying to kind of find out if there's a new deal for you and so on. So you have to learn to live with that precariousness. And that maybe isn't something that's always advertised. It kind of gets dressed up, even by those of us that do it, as this kind of dream job. And actually, in the end, no job really, I don't think, is without its issues. But I would always say, follow your passions, follow your dreams. If a job appeals to you and it gets you out of bed in the morning because you fancy really getting your teeth into what today's going to bring, then you're doing the right job for you.
Just on reflection of what we've spoke about over the last 45 minutes then, Matt, is there any event that stands out for you in terms of your co-commentary, commentary, presenting? Is there anything that stands out to you on your journey so far that you thought, oh, that was probably the best event I've been at, or that was the most exciting thing I've done? Is there anything that you can share with listeners or viewers?
Well, it's a hard one only because I've been fortunate enough to be at so many of those great sporting occasions and others and other moments that have kind of come with the upsides of the job. And obviously, as I mentioned earlier on, although I would like to think a kind of professionally neutral football watcher. Obviously, I do have my childhood predilection for Liverpool, and I was lucky enough with ITV to be in Istanbul in 2005. So perk of the job, absolutely perk of the job, to be there to see that extraordinary comeback. So you do have to pinch yourself sometimes to think, I am here. All these fans have saved up and sat in the back of vans and scrabbled their way and fought their way to get to even be here, let alone the folks at home watching on the telly. And I'm lucky enough to be sent out here by the people I work for to sit and work on and watch this unfold in front of my eyes. So you do have to thank the opportunity and the luck that came your way. But actually the one moment I would say that stays with me and I would put above all others came right near the start when I was working for the Financial Times, and they sent me to cover a kind of get-together of politicians and business people in Switzerland every winter called the World Economic Forum, which sounds quite a boring thing, and in lots of ways it is. But it sometimes throws together interesting people. And on this particular year that they sent me there, Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk came when they were still in a power-sharing period of leading South Africa to their first free elections, which, of course, Mandela went on to win with the ANC. But he was not long out of jail then, and he came, and I was lucky enough to spend about 5 or 6 minutes interviewing him. Wow. And that has stayed with me ever since, just because for all of the famous people I've been lucky enough to meet, he was the one that literally filled, not literally, that's a poor word for a journalist to use wrongly, but he it seemed like he walked in a room and the room was full of him. He just, all eyes turned to him, and you hang on his every word. He just had a charisma and a presence, born of his experience, but his natural charm and personality was just there for everybody to see, and it's never left me.
And what about the future, Matt? Is there anything that you're excited about? Obviously, we mentioned Saudi League, etc., and kind of thinking hypothetically about how things will turn out within the world of sport. But is there anything that stands out for you in terms of maybe some of the things that you're working on at the moment that might lead to maybe different avenues or potential bigger avenues in the future?
Well, I've started to do, in the last couple of years, I've started to do a bit of teaching. I teach at university, sports journalism students. So I wouldn't claim to be the world's greatest teacher, but I'd like to think I've learned enough over the last couple of decades to pass a few tips and tricks on to the students. So I do that, and that's really enjoyable for me. I think trying to help and lend a hand to those that might follow on is really rewarding. I do a little bit of that as well at the employer with other junior or starting out broadcasters or new to the job pundits, and I really enjoy that as well. So kind of more of the same, really, and a mixture of all the things that I do is really the variety and the challenge that it sets me is the bit that I really enjoy, covering the different sports. I might get the chance, I might not, but I'm hoping I might get the chance to go to the Olympics this summer now that we're part of this bigger stable under the TNT and Eurosport umbrella. I might get to do that. There's a Winter Olympics in Italy after that. So to kind of go back to where we started, the chance to use your languages, to be around a really big event and see it firsthand and ask questions of those that are producing sporting brilliance is obviously a massive treat for me. And long may it continue.
And just on that then, what advice would you maybe give to students or individuals that wanting to go down this route, or maybe think about a career change, or they might be in other industries and inspired by your persistence and your ability to put yourself in uncomfortable situations, whether that's in a Europe or with different types of individuals? You mentioned Nelson Mandela, etc. What advice would you give to maybe those listening or watching that want to have an opportunity within the world of sport?
They're probably the ones that people would imagine. You do need, obviously, the drive and determination to try your best to get there in the first place, and that involves persistence because it's not an easy industry to get into. You need some kind of start. That can come through academic tuition if you do the right kind of course, whether that's undergrad or postgrad training. You then need obviously opportunity, and that you can, now that the world of social media and YouTube and everything that's come with that, the platforms are there. Whether you can get people to notice you is obviously now a different challenge, because it's great. But the platforms are there. So think about what you might hope will be of interest to other people, and how look at what other people do. I'm a big fan of saying to the students that I work with, watch and listen and read all the sports coverage that is around you every week. But think about it critically. What can I learn from that? How do they do it? Kind of strip it back, deconstruct it. What worked, what didn't work? How do they do that? What can I take from it? So I'd say to people, be persistent. Think about what space isn't already inhabited by lots of people doing already the things that they're doing. Where is a gap in the market? And then practice to give yourself that chance to be as good as you can be. That even if it's sat with a hairbrush in front of the telly, turn the sound down on a football match and learn to commentate 5 minutes, and ask your mum and dad, your brother or your mate to give you a bit of feedback, or record yourself on your phone and then listen to it back and think, oh my God, what, I didn't think I sounded like that. How do I change it? How do I get better? What would I do differently if I had another go at it? These are ways that technology has allowed us to become amateur and thus therefore eventually professional communicators. We can do it. Our phones and the little things that we have around us can be the tools of the trade now. You don't have to wait for the big professional camera team and the lighting and the outside broadcast van to turn up outside your door. You can do it with the stuff that you already have. And then you can use that to build a little bit of a portfolio and a CV you can send to people and say, here's me, have a look.
And final question, Matt, how would you like to be remembered?
Oh God. I don't know. I don't know how to do that. I'm hoping I'm not quite old enough yet to have to answer that question. I think I'd like to think that the people I worked with would point out that I was a team player. I think that's what I would hope that would be somewhere near the top of the list, because I think if you are that, obviously, you do your best to be the best you can be at your job. But if you work with other people and try and make everybody feel happy about what they do, and don't kind of, I'd hate to think other people that I worked with have gone home and been irritated or peevish about what I'd done, how I'd behaved that day. I'd be much happier sleeping at night thinking that, Matt Smith's okay to work with. But that's all I would ask.
Excellent stuff. Matt, I just want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you. Obviously, you mentioned your journey within sport. You mentioned Istanbul, Liverpool. I grew up watching you on TV, watching those Champions League nights. And I'm also a Birmingham fan as well, so I've watched you on highlight shows, etc. as well. So I just want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity, and good luck with TNT, and good luck in the future with your career pathway, inspiring students, etc. Just want to say thank you again. Cheers.
My pleasure, Christy. Good luck to you, and of course, good luck to Birmingham, who have got, interesting times.